Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for part 2 of our Not a Partnership series, Practical Tips and Q&A. I just would like to welcome back Tod Jacobs and Dr. Peter Lynn, the co-authors of the newly published Not a Partnership, Why We Keep Getting Marriage Wrong and How We Can Get It Right. And welcome back as well to our moderator, Dr. Alexandra Chris, who will be joining us specifically during the Q&A to take all your questions to Tod and Peter. And my name is Rohi Shanehouse. I'm the program director at JNF Toronto, for those who don't know me. And just for those who joined us last time, we told you about JNF Canada's shift in recent years, taking on projects to strengthen the social infrastructure within Israel, many of which benefit Israel's vulnerable populations. So through various events over the past 3 years, JNF Future, who's hosting today's webinar, the young professionals group of JNF catering to the under 40, age group, has been raising funds for the Jaffa Daled After School Education and Enrichment Centers program expansion. So for all of you joining us for today's webinar, your generous donations have contributed to this cause, and we're pleased to say we've almost reached, after almost 3 years, the $250,000 fundraising goal for this program expansion. So thank you for that. And for those who are interested to help us get to the last little bit of that fundraising, JNF Future is actually putting together 3 different events for Hanukkah: a beer tasting hosted by Shiloh Beer Co., which is COR certified, a latke making with kosher cookbook author Daniela Silver, and a family-friendly celebration with Smarty Pants, Smarty Hanukkah. So if you're interested, more information will be sent after today's webinar, if you want to help us finish that fundraising goal. And a little bit again about Tod and Peter, just for the new attendees joining us today. So Tod Jacobs is the director of the David Robinson Institute for Jewish Heritage in Jerusalem, which he co-founded in 2005. Prior to his current role teaching and counseling his students and alumni, he enjoyed a distinguished career on Wall Street as one of the leading authorities on telecommunications and industry globally. As managing director at JP Morgan, and before that, a partner at Sanford C. Bernstein and Company. Tod acted as a frequent commentator on network television and in leading newspapers and magazines, and testified several times before the US Congress as an expert on telecom and media issues. Now about Dr. Peter Lynn. So Peter Lynn has served as Dean of Students at the David Robinson Institute for Jewish Heritage since its inception. He is an MA in Applied Positive Psychology and a Doctor of Psychology in Human and Organizational Psychology. Currently, Peter lectures at Touro College in Jerusalem, and he's also the founder and director of Greatness Within Seminars, where he helps empower individuals and organizations through the application of positive psychology. For today's webinar, please do keep your microphones off, muted, and any questions you have, please type them in the chat to Dr. Alexandra Chris, who will be moderating them during the Q&A. And without further ado, let's hear all about 4 pillars of giving. Alex, why don't you take us away?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Ruthie mentioned, my name is Alex, and I'll be the moderator today. Last time, Tod and Peter defined what a marriage is and what a great marriage looks like, and they walked us through the 3 paradigm changes that lie at the heart of properly defining a marriage. Today, they're going to be providing us with the PDF manual for a successful marriage, and more specifically, the 4 practical ways that we can give in our marriage. So I'm now going to pass it over to Peter and Tod to provide an overview, and then we'll dive right into audience questions. So make sure to have some questions prepared. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I hope all is well. Thank you so much for having us. It's nice to be back here for round 2. As Alex said, I just want to kind of give maybe a little bit of an overview of where we're going to go tonight. What we really hope is that tonight turns into more of an interactive session. But we described things last time a bit more theoretical. But the way we concluded last time is that if there's a PDF manual of how a marriage can really grow and flourish, it's via the world of giving. And what we've done in our book, which is about the whole second half, maybe a little more than that, is we've broken the world of giving down into 4 different pillars of giving, 4 different avenues of how a person can give. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to move through about the course of 20 minutes what these 4 pillars are and give you a little bit of an insight into each pillar. And then what we'll do is we'll open things up to a Q&A for all to hear your practical questions, and hopefully we can provide some insight to those questions. The 4 pillars that we're going to speak about tonight that are all offshoots of the world of giving are: number 1, people going out of their way to keep their marriage fresh and keep it young. Number 2 is people focusing on creating a high amount of respect in their relationship. Number 3 is gratitude being a central part of your relationship. And number 4 is people taking responsibility for their own character traits that they bring into their relationship. It's very easy to point the finger at the relationship or at the other person, but we don't focus on ourselves enough as far as what we bring into the relationship. And these are the 4 pillars of giving, and these are 4 different ways of how to give. So we're going to move through each one of these in a couple of minutes. Again, about 20 minutes, we'll go over them. And then please save your questions, think of the questions, and then we'll all come back together here. So I'll start off with the first one. The first one is the idea of keeping your marriage fresh. Everyone loves that period of inspiration at the beginning stages of a relationship where things are wonderful and things are vibrant and things are energizing. And then what happens, feel things fade away. That freshness that was once there no longer seems to be there. And unfortunately, what people think is that, okay, that was nice when things started, but there's no way to get that back. And a lot of people live in their relationship dreaming about the glory days of when things were actually quite fresh. And unfortunately, that's a huge mistake that many couples make, because that freshness is something that you can proactively build into your marriage. And this is a way of giving that when couples go out of their way to do certain acts that bring that freshness into their marriage, that's a beautiful way of how to give to one another and to give to the relationship. We mentioned many different ways of how to keep your marriage fresh. One of the ways that we speak about, which we've done a lot of research on, is the idea of vacations. Now, vacations are a beautiful idea and they look great in movies. Usually vacations are too expensive. We don't have time for it. We don't have a babysitter. It's not going to happen. And it's something that we dream about, but it doesn't really come alive. The concept we speak about is something called a mini vacation. And I'll set the scenario of what a mini vacation is. You have a couple that both work in the city, and they decide every 2 months that on that random Tuesday night, they're going to leave work. They're going to go to dinner someplace in the city. They're going to get a hotel somewhere in the city, stay overnight, and then next morning, back to work. It's a 10-hour, 12-hour rendezvous, and that's it. And that's something we call the mini vacation. And the benefits of the mini vacation are absolutely awesome. What it does more than anything else is that it creates that boost of freshness, which is so awesome. In addition, what the research says, which is actually quite fascinating, is that people gain much more from actually going on more vacations that are frequent and short, rather than just the benefit of going on that one big vacation that you go on every few years. And the research is actually quite amazing. And where you actually benefit, if you look at the world of how to analyze a vacation, when you're planning a vacation, there's 3 parts of it that you actually gain benefit from. Before the vacation begins, which is the planning stage, the actual vacation itself, and then looking back on the vacation and savoring the moment. So now you make that mini vacation, happen every 2 months or so. So the benefits are off the charts. And we have seen more than anything else as far as a tip for how couples can keep that freshness. It doesn't matter whether you've been married 10, 20, 30, 40 years. We've seen that couples that have gone out of their way to make this mini vacation happen, the results are really off the chart and quite awesome to see. And that is a little bit of an insight into the first pillar here of how people can go out of their way to give to their marriage to keep it really fresh and vibrant. Tod?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. The second pillar we call respect in all its forms. And one of the interesting insights that comes out of kind of classical Jewish work from the Talmud, on down, is that people think that what really begins the relationship is love. And it turns out that according to at least classical Jewish sources, it's not love that begins the relationship, it's actually respect. Now, there may be a romance piece that gets people interested, but that's not real love. But respect is something which can begin on day one of the relationship. The key is to keep it going, and that will ultimately give way to love. Now, respect has two basic forms. Respect has the way I speak to you, and it's also the way I act towards you, which itself has many, many subsets. So it kind of encompasses the whole way that I relate to the other person. If I speak to you nicely, but I don't act nicely, or if I speak and I act nicely, but I'm cheap and I won't spend any money on you. If I spend money on you, but I don't speak well to you, all of these things send a message that I just don't respect you enough, and you're really not in the center of my world and of my concern. So what we try to get people focused on is think about the way that you are relating to your spouse. If you want the litmus test, before I give you just maybe a practical way of thinking about this, the litmus test on how we're doing with respect is take a little snapshot of yourself right now, and then try to think back, what did I look like when I was dating? When I was dating my spouse, when I was dating that person who's really special to me now, whether we're married, not married, whatever the relationship is, how much care did I take in how I looked, how I was dressed, how I smelled, how I spoke, what kind of manners I displayed, right? Would I pick up my phone in the middle of a date, while this other person I was trying to impress was? So the answer, of course, is usually it's cringeworthy when I actually do this litmus test and I think about how I'm doing now vis-a-vis the way I was acting back then. And when people think about that, again, they're quite embarrassed by it. And they'll usually say, yeah, but that was an act back then. To which our response is, yeah, and how come you're not acting now? Because the key point here is that acting, when it comes to speaking better than I would normally be speaking, acting a little nicer, spending a little more freely on the person that I love than I would do naturally, what the acting doesn't mean that I'm being a faker. The acting means I'm stepping up to a vision of myself that I actually think is a bit higher than where I am expressing it naturally. So the acting is really acting as my best self. It's not some kind of fakery and manipulation. It's actually a very, very positive thing. And see if your spouse is bothered by it, they won't be. One of the practical areas to actually bring this to life is an area which I think is, it's kind of, again, it's classic Jewish thinking about marriage. And that is that people need to divide up domains. There need to be domains of activity where I trust my spouse, I entrust my spouse to kind of take the lead in that area. There may be areas that my spouse will entrust me to take the lead in certain areas. You can determine what those are, but think about some of the areas in life that exist where unfortunately we're always like looking into each other's business, trying to correct each other, trying to give like helpful hints, which aren't always so helpful, aren't always so welcome. The kitchen is a domain. The dealing with the decisions about children may be a domain. Finances are a domain. Practical things in the house are a domain. Spiritual decisions in terms of, what kind of schooling, what kind of, do we have a spiritual life? Are we religious? Are we not religious? These types of things. It's not to say, by the way, that your spouse's input doesn't matter here. It's just that if every time I'm trying to make a decision in any realm of life, I'm always going to get second guessed and I'm always going to get criticized for it. And I can never feel that I'm being built and trusted in a particular area. That kind of erodes my sense of self-esteem, my sense of well-being. And ultimately what we see is that people who are not trusted and who are henpecked and who are criticized in the arenas where they feel like they should be able to act, very, very, very frequently it sort of tears the person down. And so you can take a person who begins a marriage as a relatively confident, competent person, and enough criticism winds up, kind of destroying that over time, and the person loses that sense of well-being. So it's an interesting discussion to have on a date night. Is there any domain that you feel like you would like to take the lead in? Is there any domain you feel like I would like to take the lead in? And see if you can actually try to divide up a little bit your marriage into some spaces where I'm going to be able to take the lead in decision making. She's going to be able to take the lead in certain decision making. Of course, always wanting to invite the other person in for some feedback, but not when it's not welcome and not in a critical way. See if that's something that can't, in a sense, create boundaries that are very, very healthy for the two people, to empower both people in terms of their operations in the relationship. Something to think about on a date night, just a place to start. Hand it back to Peter.
Great. So the third pillar here that we want to discuss is the world of gratitude. Now, we just came off of Thanksgiving, so everyone's speaking about the world of gratitude. I will tell you the number one obstacle that destroys gratitude, and that is the world of expectations. And it's quite a fascinating thing. If you look at the world of gratitude, a person walks to a Starbucks, you forget your credit card. As you're leaving Starbucks, someone comes after you and says, "Excuse me, sir, you left your credit card." Oh, you can't believe it. Greatest person in the world. You take a selfie, you send the person a holiday card, you tell everyone about your Shabbat table. It's like the greatest hero in the world. Now, you have no idea who this person is. You have no idea what they were doing 10 minutes before they were in line with you. And really what they did was they didn't steal your credit card. They did a basic act that any hopefully healthy human being would do. But what happens is you weren't expecting anything. This person gave you something which was so awesome, giving you your card back, that you're overwhelmed in the world of gratitude. My wife does about a few hundred things for me every single day. Unfortunately, what happens is I have expectations that, you know what, these are things that should be done. They're done every day and they should be done every day. And that's the way it is. So what happens when she does what she does every single day? Okay, I'm content. When she goes way beyond the call of duty, wow, you'll see my gratitude. And when she goes one little ounce below those expectations, I'm a frustrated spouse. And if there's anyone in this world that deserves the most gratitude, it's her. And if you look at the research, one of the things which can keep a relationship, any relationship, but especially a marriage, alive and flourishing is when gratitude is a central part of it. When it comes to the world of gratitude, there are two aspects to it. There is not just feeling gratitude, but there is expressing gratitude. You can't have one without the other. And what happens a lot in relationships, especially close relationships, we assume that, of course, this person knows how much I appreciate them. The downfall to all gratitude is when you start making those assumptions. And when it comes to those relationships that we are closest to, especially our marriages, never make any assumptions. And the more you can fill your relationship with lots of gratitude, especially small acts of showing gratitude, what you'll find is that the energy in the relationship and the level of connection goes up tremendously. And it is something that if people just even start to practice it in a very small way, you will see differences in how you treat each other, how you speak to each other, how you care for each other in a very different manner, very fast. Tod?
Okay, all right, thanks. The fourth pillar in the book, we call it All Depends on Me. And I think really we, both Peter and I, think of it as probably being the most central tenet that holds up the book and the most important chapter out of all the chapters. And the concept is that we are, again, and this a little bit gets back to the title of the book. The book is called Not a Partnership, which always puzzles people initially until they understand what we mean. The spoiler alert, of course, is that marriage is a great partnership. But when we treat it like a partnership, like most people treat partnerships in businesses, I think we spoke a little bit about last time, we wind up spending too much of our time looking over our shoulder at trying to figure out exactly what my spouse is not doing. I'm always looking at myself as I'm doing fine, I'm doing my thing, you know, I go out to work, I work so hard, I do this, I do that, I do this around the house. How come you're not pulling your weight? And that can be a very, very pernicious dynamic that comes into a relationship, and it does come into most relationships if people aren't really, really careful. And so what we have seen many times is when couples begin to get into that dynamic, and by the way, the first way you see it, and this is quoting one of the famous rabbis who deals with marriage and love, Rabbi Dessler, he says, the key sign of it is that I begin making demands on you. If you look at your relationship and you see, wow, I made a bunch of demands on my spouse, or you feel a bunch of demands have been made on me, Rabbi Dessler says the moment you see yourselves making demands on each other, you know that your happiness is already gone. It may be even too late. We don't happen to believe it's too late, by the way, and we believe that the way to get around it is, instead of sitting with my arms crossed and waiting for my spouse to now kind of like begin to, respond to all the nice things I'm doing, or to begin to, make the first move because after all, I did it last time. What we found is that if someone basically says to his or herself, I am going to basically put my spouse to the side in this exercise. I'm going to focus myself now on my own issues. What toxic issues am I bringing into this relationship? And what can I do about it, irrespective of what my spouse may or may not be doing? Now, most of us think that we're really, really complicated, and we have lots of issues and all these things. But the truth of the matter is, most of us have one or two toxic character traits which kind of permeate many areas of our life. We may control it well in the workplace, where the consequences are very, very high and very immediate from having bad character traits, but they tend to spill over in all of our relationships, and nowhere do they spill over like they do at home when we let our guard down. So, by the way, if you can't figure out what is the toxic thing that you bring to your relationship, just ask your spouse. Okay, they'll be happy to tell you. Okay, but you have to be willing to listen. Okay, that's the caveat there. But most of us know it's anger, or it's laziness, or it's selfishness, or it's something like that. So instead of my waiting for my spouse, what we have found, and we have seen people turn relationships around when they do this, I say to myself, 1 second, what is my toxic contribution to this relationship? Anger. Okay, that's probably poisoning this relationship. If I have kids, it's probably poisoning my relationship with my kids. For sure, it's poisoning my relationship with my spouse. I'm going to now work on anger. And without any looking at my spouse to see if she is doing what she's supposed to be doing, I start working on anger. I get some books on anger. I listen to a podcast on anger. I start downloading material on anger. I might need a therapist to go deal with anger, or a coach, right? Depending on how out of hand it is and how ingrained it is. I start working on it. Now, initially, what's going to happen is my spouse is going to respond and say, okay, what do you want from me? Like, you're trying to be like nice to me, like you're trying to like hold your anger. Like, what do you want? And they're going to think you're being manipulative if you've been toxically angry for a long period of time over the relationship. If you say to them, this is not about you, I'm just trying to fix this problem, I hope you'll benefit from it, but I really want to fix this problem because I think it's bad and I think it's poisoning the relationship and the home. And eventually, you make a breakthrough, and the spouse begins to believe that you actually mean it this time. And when one spouse sees that the other side is really working on something, really working on a character trait, then once you pass through that period of disbelief and kind of skepticism, generally what you find is that the other spouse begins to say, well, gee, he's working so hard, or she's working so hard on this. I wonder what I might be bringing to this that I could be working on. And then next thing you know, the side table on the other side of the bed is suddenly, about laziness or about arrogance or about whatever. And it is the most incredibly virtuous cycle that can be kicked into gear when one person literally says, irrespective of my spouse, I am going to begin to make this work, and I'm going to do it by working on myself. And we've just seen amazing results with this over and over again. It's hard to lose. Again, there are marriages which may be so dysfunctional that they are beyond salvation. That's true, but most marriages are not, and there's almost no more powerful way to get a marriage kicked back into gear than by saying, it depends on me. I'm not waiting for the other, and I'm going to try and be as strong and as inspiring as possible in what I'm going to now start contributing to the relationship. And we've seen that be an incredible game changer for relationships. So that, in approximately 20 minutes, is our 4 pillars. I think it's the fastest we've ever gone through them. Okay, but hopefully you got a little bit of a taste of them. And maybe Alex will hand it back over to you in terms of conducting some Q&A here.
Thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating and a wonderful overview. So now I want to turn it over to the audience to ask some questions. So I see Faith has posed a question in the chat. I'm going to read off Faith's question, but for those of you who haven't asked questions, definitely share them in the chat, or feel free to message me privately if it's something more confidential and you don't want your name shared. I definitely won't do that. So let's start with Faith's question. Can you please talk a little bit more about the areas for decision making? How do you decide who is responsible for which area?
Okay, that's a beautiful question. And of course, it's complicated. It will have an awful lot to do with who are the two of you? Are you conservative people? Are you progressive people? Are you religious people? Are you atheistic people? Did you see marriage as being kind of like the old traditional view of marriage? Did you see marriage in a single parent house? Did you see marriage in a, it really depends a lot on your values. And of course, it become more complicated if your values are not really shared between you and your spouse. Within the great divide that the Talmud discusses, okay? The Talmud talks about, for example, an area called the home. Now, by the way, it happens to be that in the world of Torah thinking, the home is considered the most important place in your universe. We don't view the home as kind of a belittling place where all the small stuff in your all the small stuff in your world happens. To the contrary, you have a professional life, but your real life is in your home and building your home. So there's kind of like running the home. At the far extreme, there's kind of, let's call it purely spiritual decision making, such as, what are our religious values going to be? If we're Jewish, are we going to have any kind of, ritualistic Jewish vision in our life? If we're not Jewish, are we going to, are we going to be Sabbath observant? Are we going to be 10 Commandment observant? Now these may seem like, I don't know, either obvious or true, but the truth is people have to decide what they're going to do with some of these things. What do we represent as a couple and as a family? And then there's kind of like almost everything in between. So in the classic Talmudic version of it, there's kind of the home, there's, that's called, it's very practical. And then there's very spiritual, and then there's everything in between. And those are three domains which have to be discussed. Now, within those domains, of course, there are subdomains. I think the best thing to do, especially because for many people, this is such a new idea, such a strange and new and wonderful idea. I think the best thing to do is sit down with your spouse and say, how do we divide up life? Do you feel there's a place where I should be like taking the lead? I know one thing. My wife is way more in tune with our children, and always was. I mean, my kids are older now, but my wife was always way, way, way more in tune with our children than I was. And I know that my wife really liked offloading, financial responsibility in terms of decision making on many things, right, on me. Now that's the way we were. Could have been in many houses, it might be the exact opposite. It doesn't really matter who's doing what. What matters is that we can discuss it. I can say to my wife, hey, this particular area, do you want to take the lead in that area? Would you like to sort of take responsibility and the buck stops with you? And of course, if you need me, I'm here for you. And, and maybe I'll try this. I think it makes for a really interesting discussion to try to figure out what areas of life are there? Where are we not operating and functioning well? By the way, if you want to really know which areas you got to focus on, where do we fight the most? Do we fight about financial issues a lot? And why do we fight about them? Do we fight about them because you want to invest in the stock market and I want to spend money on renovations? Or do we argue about, whether or not, do we have enough money? Should we be borrowing money? I mean, if there's a particular area you're arguing and fighting in, make that an area where you say, hey, let's at least do an experiment. Why don't you take charge of this area? Let's give it 6 months. You take charge of this area. I'm here to give you input. I'm here to give you support. I'm here to give you an attaboy if you need it. But let's try that and see how it works. Okay. By the way, another area, I know it may seem trivial, but I know couples that fight all the time because a particular couple, for example, where the woman was raised in a very traditional home and she really wants to kind of run the kitchen. She has a whole vision for how she wants to feed her kids and what she wants to feed her kids and how she likes to cook the food. And she's but her husband is constantly coming in and telling her that's not healthy enough. That has too much salt. Now, again, it sounds trivial. Over a long period of time, this can really erode someone's A, confidence in what they're doing, and B, desire to even keep doing it. If I'm constantly being criticized for something that some area of life that I'm operating in, the last thing at some point, I just want to give up and say, I'm not interested. You do it. That's kind of like where you wind up. So you don't like my cooking, you don't want too much salt, too much oil, too much this, too much this, you do it. And who suffers from that? Everybody does. And particularly the kids suffer from it if they're kids in the relationship. So again, it's one of those areas where it may seem trivial when you at first glance. It's really not trivial at all in the actual dynamic of a marriage. If one side wants tasty food and the other side wants hyper healthy food, that's a real problem. They're going to fight all the time about what they're eating and what their kids are being fed. So again, I think the way into this is make it a date night. We're going to take the next 2 date nights and we're going to like put it all on the table. We're going to try and divide up life into a few areas. We're going to focus on areas where we kind of fight a lot, and let's divide it up and let's see how it works. What maybe it works better if we just cede that to you, cede this to me, and we cease fighting over these things. And wow, when we stop fighting, we start working together more, the whole dynamic of the relationship changes. And then again, we can keep reinforcing some of these things as we go. Okay, so I don't know if that really, I think that's the only way I know. If you don't have a pre-existing picture of what the domains and roles are, which each side takes a role in, that to me is at least a way into that subject. Peter, you want to add to?
I have a question for clarification. So,
Sure.
because I was wondering before you brought in this example, so what if you split up your roles and your tasks, and let's say your partner is working, he's responsible for one area, but I don't like the way he does it. And so I'm constantly picking on the way he does it. So in this case, the husband is not happy with how his wife is doing the cooking. So,
Right.
so how can you just quickly clarify, how do you resolve that? How do you let it go? So is the husband supposed to let it, should the husband let it go?
Yes.
And the wife cook? Yeah.
Well, I think it's a great question, Alex. I think either the husband has to say, I'm taking it over with your permission.
Okay.
Or we're gonna, or by the way, it doesn't have to be that one side takes over everything. So you tell the husband, listen, you don't think my cooking is healthy enough. I don't think your cooking is tasty enough. I'll take Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You take the other 3 days, and we'll go out to eat on the 7th day. Whatever it is. There are many different ways to divide it up. The key thing is that I shouldn't feel that I'm being watched over and criticized, and that what I'm doing is not good enough. I should be fully empowered on the days that I'm doing it. Or by the way, if you want to, again, if the husband is saying, health, or taste, whatever it is, they can absolutely agree to transfer the title of chief cook to that person. By the way, the fact that my wife, for example, or I might be in charge of cooking does not mean that the other side is not allowed to do dishes. Okay, that's another area. Maybe dishes need to be, no matter who's in charge, could be that dishes need to be divided up on specific nights or specific meals or whatever. But the key thing is to get out of each other's business and to respect boundaries and the other's decision-making in these areas. And I think it's a great couple of date nights to this is a whole new arena to think about for people. And it would be fun to say, how do we divide up our marriage? How do we divide up the time that we spend together into areas of influence? And what would it be like for me to take over the finances? By the way, sometimes, by the way, the last thing the husband who's constantly picking on his wife about her cooking, the last thing he wants is to be suddenly in charge of the kitchen. He wouldn't have the first idea of how to put out a meal that his kids will eat, or that even he would want to eat in the end. So, so it will take some work, it'll take some creativity, but I think it's a great place to have a interesting discussion, and it can really clear up arenas where we fight too much.
Faith, I saw your hands go up. Did you want to add anything or ask a question?
Yeah. So I appreciate all of that, and I think it's all really good points. I guess where I feel like it's missing some reality check is part of some of those issues are monumentally important in planning one's life and raising one's children. And so to just relinquish control, I think, is a really tall order when you're saying, so somebody's dealing with all of the finances and they get to make all the final choices, or so much so that you're saying, this is how religious we are going to be as a family, or, this person wants tasty food and this person wants healthy food. Well, too bad. If you want, if you want healthy food, this is how I cook. Isn't it fair to want to have your opinion you know, working together from both sides on lots of those different things?
Right. It's a beautiful question. It's a wonderful question. And I think the key is that, and we write about this in the book, the idea is not to become a dictator in the area. The idea is to take responsibility for the area. And I think that's a distinction. So if let's say I'm going to take responsibility for the finances, I would never, ever make an important financial decision without my wife's buy-in. But on the other hand, who's got the responsibility for balancing the checkbook? Who's got responsibility for paying the bills as they come in? Who's got primary responsibility for, let's say, doing the first take at investments that we're thinking of? And it should never ever be a dictator. No one should ever be a dictator in their sphere of responsibility and influence. Okay, but on the other hand, unfortunately the opposite is so ridden with so much fighting. If everything becomes a group grope, and I can't respect your leadership in this area, and you can't respect my leadership in that area, we wind up fighting over everything. Because I agree with you. Almost everything is important, by the way. Almost everything is important. Almost every spiritual decision, the way that we raise our kids, where we send our kids to school, the way we furnish our homes, how much money we spend on furnishing our homes versus how much we put away, versus how much we spend on clothing and vacations. These are all big decisions. But if everything is a fight, and everything is a group grope, and nobody can ever sort of make a decision, that's like you painted one extreme, which is terrible, which is dictatorship. The other extreme, which is they call it in Hebrew hefkerus, which means chaos, is also a disaster. So that's why I say you have to be creative to kind of work together and to take on responsibilities. And then within those responsibilities, I mean, the idea is always to solicit. What do you think about this? Is this tasty to you? Do you like the way this is going? What would you do here if you were me? That's a very different thing than someone coming in and saying, there's too much salt in there. Please, you're using too much salt. So it does take responsibility, and it does take a little creativity, and it also does mean ceding a little bit of control, which some of us don't like to do, right? That's but we think it helps a lot in the dynamic if you can get it right. Peter, do you want to add anything to that?
Good.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to ask another question that came in privately. And then I do see that we have another public question, but let me get to the private one first. Is it beneficial or detrimental to a marriage to put timelines on goals? Example, working on our toxic traits, bettering ourselves in the marriage, and having kids.
So maybe let me put the children having kids or not aside for right now. Let me try and focus more on the character traits or trying to work on things to strengthen the marriage. Of course, a person should always be working hard to grow, and a person should always be working hard to change. What I do find, though, is that it's very easy in the world of growth for things to peter off quite fast. And what I find, especially in today's world where we are so busy and so overwhelmed and trying to balance so many things, that what I do find is that when people work on things a bit more intensely over sometimes a shorter period of time, then it's way more effective because you focus on it that much more. Now, obviously, to change anything in life, anything real, takes time and takes effort. So I'm not talking about a weekend rendezvous or just 5 days of this, but let's say I have, certain thing to work on me as an individual. I'm going to gain much more by me working on that in some sort of intensive way for a few months straight and really going for it and reading those books and going to that therapist and listening to that podcast. And I'm going to gain much more by me doing what I can to give it a lot of time and effort rather than just make it kind of a once a week thing that I tap into or think about. So I do find that whether it's you working on something for yourself or you working on something as a couple, that because we're so busy, because we're scattered, because there's so many things going on, if you don't give it a lot of time and energy, then usually we don't really see change. And for people to give something a lot of time and energy, you can't do that for too long, or either what happens is, number one, you get burnt out from it, or number two, things kind of just peter out, which I said before, and then it's can almost sometimes have a negative impact on the whole situation. So what I find is that when you're coming to think about whether it's your own growth or things you're trying to do in the marriage, it's best to try and work a little bit more intensely for a period of time, and then maybe take a break and then come back to it, rather than saying, okay, over the next 3 years, we're going to work on this. Now, just a disclaimer is that obviously we're talking about, things which are very deep, or things that are very serious that require, real professional help. So then you're already in a bit of a different category, because it would be up to the professional to decide how things should be, worked on. But let's say a couple's trying to bring more gratitude into their marriage, which is a relatively easier thing. Let's take it that both, the couple is a healthy couple, and gratitude just is something that they don't do, not something that they're blocked from. So if they worked on that in more of an intensive manner over a shorter period of time, they would probably see a jump in their marriage much faster than if they decide, hey, let's just work on this over the course of the year without a clear plan, without a clear time limit. Things probably won't change that much.
Yeah, I would just add one thing, and that is that, when I see my spouse working on something with herself, again, as Peter said, we can kind of generate that enthusiasm, that inspiration for ourselves on an intensive basis for a relatively short period of time. If it's going to go on longer and it's going to continue to improve, it needs a lot of encouragement. And that's when we start spilling over from one pillar to another, right? So, it all depends on me, but then gratitude should be kicking in, because if I see my spouse is like, oh my gosh, she's like what she's done with, she used to have an anger problem, or she used to have this, or I'm working on some kind of problem. She's telling me, it's so amazing what you've done. And so I feel so much better. I feel that is the kind of energy that people can keep running their engines on for a very long period of time. Almost nobody tires of hearing, thank you for what you're doing. I really appreciate what you're doing. And to the contrary, not only do we not tire from it, it gives us a lot of energy to keep the work flowing. And so I agree with Peter. It's very intensive at first and very self-directed. And then hopefully it begins to spill over right into the gratitude world, which then keeps the whole cycle moving in a very positive way.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, Peter? Or
Nope.
Okay. Just to kind of follow up, so negativity and criticism, of course, can be quite detrimental to a relationship. But what happens if your partner isn't cognizant of some of their potential flaws or weaknesses, and it really does bother you? What are your recommendations for kind of sharing it with that person and letting them know in a respectful way?
So I'll tell you, I'll kind of give you the mini seminar in the world of communication. And if you look at all seminars in the world of communication, it'll probably boil down to these two things. Okay. Just before I go into it, of course, difficult conversations need to happen. And of course, we need to point out to each other where things need to change. On the side, unfortunately, we don't point out to each other where things are going well often enough, but that's a separate conversation. But difficult conversations are one of the most amazing things that can bring your relationship so close together if they go right. What happens with most difficult conversations, they usually spiral to some sort of negative place too fast, and therefore it leaves two people feeling quite alone. There are two fundamental ideas behind all communication. That is, number one is timing, and number two is how you say it. Okay, I'll go through it right now. Number one, timing, is we fall into the trap of urgency. Everything has to be spoken about right now. Well, a lot of the time, right now is not the right time to have that conversation. You're in the middle of a project, he's on his way to work, there are kids outside, we have to go somewhere right now. And there are very few things in a marriage that are urgent that have to be discussed right now. What if we wait? Let's wait till tonight till we both get home. Let's wait till this weekend till we're a bit more relaxed and we can turn our phone off and go for a walk. Let's wait maybe till next week when we're going to go away on a date night or something. All of a sudden, you find the right time when the couple's in a good place to talk about something, when the phones are off, when people are relaxed, when people are feeling loved, when you're actually a bit removed from the emotions of the situation. All of a sudden, you get the timing right. Woo! Amazing. Number 2 is, how do you say it? When we communicate with people, we get so caught up by saying the right thing. But a lot of our communication has very little to do with our words. A lot of it is everything else, the body language, the tone of voice, all these things. And even more than that, when we speak, a lot of times we speak in a very attacking manner, especially when it's a sensitive issue with our spouse. When all of a sudden you speak not just in an open and warm way, but you speak in the language of we have to fix this. How can we work on this together? All of a sudden you have a conversation which allows the person who is hearing this not to jump on the defense wagon immediately. When you get these 2 factors right, when you can check the box and say, okay, check on the timing, check I'm saying it right, then what you'll find is you can talk about almost anything and it will lead you to a closer space. When you can't check the box on these 2 things, I would highly recommend waiting, because if I'm in Vegas, I'm going to bet that this conversation is not going to go the right way. So I think that important things need to be spoken about. Things that bother us need to be spoken about 100%. But if you don't speak about it the right way, then you're going to see that conversation is just going to lead to a bigger issue. And who knows what can happen after that.
Okay, thank you. So I want to ask a question that Eric has posed. I think it's a really, really interesting question. How can one integrate the pillars that you speak about into dating to find a partner, particularly figuring out the difference between an incompatibility and an area for self-improvement? That's very interesting.
Okay, it's obviously a great question. Look, we spend a lot of time with our students in this process of kind of thinking about, who should my significant other be? What kind of person am I looking for? Do I want someone, probably the great divide is, do I want someone just like myself? We both are Republicans. We both love Trump. We both love, we both hate Trump. Must we agree on everything? Or to the contrary, do I want somebody who's actually quite different from me? And therefore we complement with an E, not with an I, with an I also, but different times. We complement each other by offsetting each other. I'm missing this, she's missing this, she has this, I have this. We pull together and we create a bigger whole than we could ever be by ourselves. That's the kind of 2 people with differences. The rule of thumb, and everybody will have to now have that little talk with themselves, is, am I a very strong person, or am I a somewhat weaker, needier person? Now, why do I say that? Because the stronger you are, the rule of thumb is the stronger you are, the more you can tolerate and appreciate someone who's quite different than you and thinks differently than you and doesn't believe all the same exact things in you, doesn't express themselves the same way you like to. So for example, somebody who is by the way, strong does not mean, don't conjure up anything in your image that it means either macho or that it means, dominant or anything. Strong simply means a certain sense of self-possession and a certain self-confidence in who I am as a human being, a certain, self-esteem. And so, for example, if I'm a strong person and I'm an introvert, I will really gravitate towards and be really attracted by the fact that, wow, she's really an extrovert. She really lights up a room. I like, I'm in the corner, like by myself at when I get in a room with more than 3 people, she lights up the room and she can make conversation. She does all these things. I am very right brain oriented, and whoa, she's so left brain oriented, or vice versa. And the stronger you are, the more not only can you tolerate that, but you can really appreciate that in somebody else. But you have to be real with yourself, because not everybody can do that. Some people, we've had students who have told me, this is the way I see the world, and I cannot possibly imagine marrying a girl who doesn't see the world the same exact way as I do. Now, by the way, you need to, let's put one big caveat in there. You do need to have shared values. I'm not talking about I'm a super dyed-in-the-wool atheist, but I'm going to marry a really religious person. That's not called kind of like differences in personality that we can respect in each other. That's called, you want to go that way with your life and I want to go that way with my life. And we might be physically attracted to each other, or we might be a little fascinated with each other, but that is bound to crash and burn at some point. So the first rule of thumb is, the stronger I am, the more differences I can tolerate and appreciate. But even that comes with another caveat, and that is, make sure that the difference is not so extreme that it will really drive you out of your mind after a short period of time. So again, we're different. We see the world a little differently. She's more emotive, or I'm more intellectual. She's more intellectual. I'm more emotive. That's great. But when it becomes something where I don't really respect fundamentally what that person has, that's already too big a difference. It's gone too far. And that's called being foolhardy, to say I want to marry that person and kind of pull those extremes together, because that is almost bound to fail. So there's a wonderful book by a colleague of ours who teaches in Jerusalem, whose name is Hannah Levitan, and she wrote a book called "That's Why I Married You," and the book basically talks about the fact that what tends to fascinate us about people when we meet them is, wow, she's so different than I am, in the ways I was talking about a moment ago. And that's really fascinating. And then you get married, but then it becomes an irritant. Why does she have to be so noisy at parties? Why can't she just have a real conversation with one person? Why does she have to float around the room, talk to everybody? Oh, 3 months ago before we were married, that was really fascinating to me. Now it's irritating to me. So what winds up happening is, the thing that was fascinating after you get married tends to be irritating. And then the work begins to make sure that I can now make space for that person and come to respect that. And yes, build that into a whole that is bigger than either of us could have done by ourselves. Okay, so that's kind of like this process of identifying a difference and then ultimately having to work to really integrate it. But if your values don't match up, your fundamental values don't match up, stay out of it. If you don't respect each other and I think that the givens are, you need a person who is kind, you need a person who is thoughtful, you need a person who is considerate, and you need a person who gets you. And if you have those in place, and there's some basic physical attraction as well, that has to be there also, by the way, then that is the makings of a relationship, which requires work and giving, and then you can make it happen. So I said a lot, but that's more or less the parameters we see on that.
That's really, really interesting. Thank you. Okay, so I'm keeping an eye on the time. We have about 6 minutes left. There's 2 questions. So there's one from Shanna, and then there's another question from Brittany that she asked earlier. So I'm going to ask Shanna's question first, and then perhaps you can conclude with Brittany's question, because I think you can provide some quick tips. So Shanna's asking, often people get help from mentors, so family or others, such as friends, to make big life decisions. When 2 people begin making team decisions, how do they manage who they should go to, who the go-to opinion should be, and not suffer from input overload? So if you can spend just a few minutes on that. And then Brittany's question is about keeping the marriage fresh during COVID. So I thought maybe you could end with some quick tips there.
So I'll take the first question here. So I would say like this, there's 2 things which I want to point out. Number one is the fact that you've been asking about mentors and about getting advice is an amazing thing. Unfortunately, most people go through the world of marriage with the assumption that they should have it worked out. They don't really need any outside input. They can figure it out themselves. And we don't do that in any other place in our life. The whole world of LinkedIn is about reaching out to connections and finding people who have more experience than you. And just anywhere, in any other place in your life, you're never going to do things by yourself. When I spent a lot of time in the world of athletics when I was younger, there was never an idea that I would try and train by myself. It was always, I'd find a coach. I'd find people who have been down this path before. And unfortunately, when it comes to relationships, people don't do that. And it's a huge mistake. So the fact that you're actually asking the question and thinking about this, I think it puts you 9 million steps ahead of the game. Number 2 is, you're right. We live in a world today of information overload, and that can apply with mentors as well. As I always say, too many cooks in the kitchen never goes anywhere, and it can a lot of times create more chaos. I think what has to happen is you need to, sit down with your spouse and figure out, okay, we know too much advice isn't going to be great for anyone. Who are the people that we really feel get us and believe in us and are healthy role models as far as to give good advice, that are examples of what I want to be, many things, which I won't go into right now. But I think that if you do narrow it down, you'll find that two things happen. Number one, you gain a lot of clarity. And number two, you actually become more independent in your decision making because you get used to understanding what the advice might potentially be. And therefore, that gives you a deeper level of insight because you're now gaining tools of how to think and how to process information yourself. When we start getting information from all over the place, you never actually learn the tools that are being given to you during the conversations of advice giving. So you never really get built yourself. When I have, in my own personal life, I have certain mentors for certain things, I can almost tell you what they're going to tell me when I ask a question. So it's made my questions to them that much better because I'm already taking into consideration all of the advice they've given me in the past because I've spent so much time with them. So maybe that's just an answer to that can hopefully be helpful there.
Okay, last question, Alexandra. What's the question?
Okay, so thank you. So the last question is, how do you suggest couples can keep their marriage fresh during COVID?
Okay, maybe I'll jump in and maybe Peter will want to add to here, but look, it's obviously COVID is a huge challenge and, everybody has different circumstances. We have a number of students who are married and sometimes with a kid also, where they are in New York City. They're both working full-time. They both have full-time jobs and they have a kid and they, guess what? They have either a studio or a one-bedroom apartment. And guess what? There's no place to go. And they both have to be. So that's a pressure cooker. That's a pressure cooker. And that is, so the very, very first thing we have to start with is an attitude change, which is that I am going to have to live in a different mode of being willing to give in on a lot of stuff that normally I don't give it on. It's an overall, we all literally have to sit down and say, my job right now is to be really calm and really caring and really understanding. It's a mindset shift. Now that may be a bigger shift for some men than, okay, I don't want to be sexist about this, but unfortunately it tends to be maybe a bigger mind shift that men have to go through than women. But obviously, we can't overly generalize about these things. But that's important is just a mindset. Now, but I think that the practical things that we've seen that work for people are, I have to recognize, and my spouse has to recognize, that each of us needs downtime. Every single day we need downtime. Now, our downtime is not going to coincide in terms of being the same hour, and it's also not going to be the same activity. Her downtime might be, I remember when we had infants, newborns, and my wife was, I was in our house, it was divided up that I was working 15-hour days and my wife was home and she had this baby. And I remember it was so overwhelming to deal with that baby. And my wife was so sleep deprived. And I kept messing up because when she would have, finally the baby would go to sleep, I would expect her, go to sleep, like go catch up on your sleep, like how could you not go? But that's not what she wanted to do. She wanted to feel like a human being. She wanted to read a magazine. She wanted to write a letter. She wanted to read a book, even though it was going to come at the expense of her sleep. So we have to realize the way that the downtime will be necessary for my spouse will not be, I can't dictate that to my spouse. I can't tell her this is what you should be doing. She can't tell me this is what I should be doing. I might want to just sit and look at sports scores and she might want to do sleep or do whatever. We have to make that available. Each of us has to say, I am giving you an hour and a half off every single day to do what you need to do. And if you can't both do it every single day, then do it every other day. But you have to make that something. The other thing is that people tend to say, well, we're all together all the time. So, and all the restaurants are closed, and all the bars are closed, and all the cafes are closed. So date night is out the window. We say quite to the contrary. Date night is more important now. What does date night look like now? We're in the apartment all day together. We're on top of each other all the time. But you know what we do on date night? Especially if there's no kids, but even if there is a kid, there's some point at which the kid goes to sleep or we put the kid to sleep or whatever it is. change the lighting, order in food, get a bottle of wine. That's apparently an essential business in New York State, right? Liquor stores, okay. And I don't know if that's what it is in Toronto, an essential business. No liquor store will ever close. Okay, get a bottle of wine, order in a pizza if you can still get order in. If you can still get, I think you can still get takeout in Toronto, right? So like change the lighting, change the music, and each of you make sure that you go and spend that 15 or 20 minutes making yourself look great and smell great and like dress up. I mean, I know you think, well, we're just in our house together. But you know, when my spouse dresses up, that's really exciting for me. And when I dress up and she knows it's for her, not because I'm trying to impress my boss or somebody outside, it's just another way of showing respect and interest and creating freshness. And if we can do that on a regular basis and make that evening really special, that is a way to totally change the week. I mean, and you can do that every single week, and maybe you can do it twice a week. Okay, and just try to be creative within the boundaries that we're all trying to operate in now. And that's the best advice I can give is a bit of a mindset change that you have to keep reminding yourself of, and then make sure that you have these special times that you set up for yourselves.
Perfect. I think that's a really great suggestion and a great way to end this webinar. So again, I want to thank you, Tod and Peter, for joining us today, for sharing all of your insights. We all have some homework to do to think about how we can improve our relationships and even improve ourselves potentially, so that we can find our soulmates. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you again soon.
Okay, thank you so much for having us.
Bye.
Bye-bye.